People are sort of zooming in here now, which I'm welcoming everyone again to our last interview in this series of interviews with dismantling racism experts for this class, dismantling racism from theory to practice. Erica, so you know this is the last week of this class, but people have been very engaged and particularly engaged with these interviews. So just again, orienting people, if any of you are here for the first time, the way we've been running this is I will have a conversation with Erica to sort of kick us off. I'm going to do a formal introduction of her in a moment. Got some prepared questions, but then as soon as we can, maybe about 20, 25 minutes in, we'll switch over to your questions again. And I'm going to start now, so we've got plenty of time for this conversation with Erica Littlewolf, by giving a formal introduction, and then we'll start with our conversation. So first off, welcome, Erica, to the University of Montana and this class. So glad to have you here with us. And it is my deep honor and privilege to be able to introduce you all to Erica Littlewolf. Let me say a little bit about her. Erica is from the Northern Cheyenne and works for Mennonite Central Committee Central States with the Indigenous Visioning Circle. And I'll let her describe what that is and what it involves. She describes herself as being committed to the work of decolonization, authentic relationship, and healing. And with her Bachelor's of Science in Psychology and American Indian Studies, Erica applies her education to social justice issues and how they impact Indigenous people. Erica grew up in Busby, Montana, and has traveled extensively across the country and around the globe as she's been increasingly asked to lead conversations on the Doctrine of Discovery, which again, I'll leave to Erica to describe. As part of her role, she's contributed to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and she's known for her overall excellence, awesomeness, insight, and great humor that I know from experience she brings to all of her engagements. So again, please join me in welcoming Erica Littlewolf here to the University of Montana. Welcome.
Yeah.
Great to have you here. So why don't we just start with the first question that you've seen already, and that's just to tell us a bit about yourself, your anti-racism history and involvements, and the communities to which you're connected.
Alrighty. Wolfdom Wanhat Nahishavin Natistas Na Pivadayas. Just introducing myself in my traditional language. As Tobin said, I'm Northern Cheyenne, and I am located currently on my traditional homelands of the Northern Cheyenne Nation. And what was your question, Tobin?
So, yeah, it's a long question, so I'll repeat it again. You've already started by telling us a bit about yourself, your anti-racism history and involvements, and the communities to which you're connected. So you've already done a bunch of that, but
okay.
Please go ahead and add anything else you want.
About myself, I grew up on the reservation. My dad is Northern Cheyenne and my mother is white. She's actually Jewish, but she didn't grow up identifying that way. And so I grew up being raised in the reservation, but being bused off to go to a predominantly white school. I went to college in South Dakota. I did some graduate school with a master's of social work, and that was when Hurricane Katrina hit. And I was in a program that didn't acknowledge the systemic racism in Hurricane Katrina, so I quit that program. And then I ended up doing a law program in Indigenous law for a little bit and then quit that program. And now I've decided I'm really not built for, for the educational system anymore. I've studied in India with a school of peace in Bangalore, India, in South India. And I've been to Indigenous communities around the globe and have visited them and how they are impacted by colonization. And how some I've visited on restorative justice in Ethiopia with revenge killings and things like that. Those are the highlights of my life. And I feel like I actually learned better that way through relationship. My anti-racism history, I feel like formally I started getting analysis through Mennonite Central Committee and the Damascus Road program probably in about 1999. And then I began through my college years, apprenticing as a trainer through the Damascus Road program. And to be honest, like, I got it. Like, I loved the language. I loved, like, wow, I got all these terms now, like white privilege and all these different terms of all of these concepts that I had experienced growing up. And then once I had the language, I was like, woo, this is cool. But I never caught on to actually teaching it. Like, I was just at that point in my life, I didn't see myself as a teacher. And so I think I stayed with that a while and was just like, yo, I'm not a teacher. And then they ended up putting me on the board, I think, because I think, yeah, I think they probably didn't want to part with me. And so then I got transitioned to the board. And so I've done that. And I think a lot of my work has probably been more hands-on. And reflecting on my lived experience, like, oh, okay, that's why things were the way they were. Growing up in southeastern Montana, and we're very close to Sheridan, Wyoming, I remember as a child being looked at funny when we would go to restaurants with a white mother and a native father, and being phenotypically dark and resembling a native person. People always seeing me that way, and so always thinking when I was with my mother, thinking I was adopted, and so having all these identities, and only probably in the last 10 years realizing that identifying as a person who is mixed is also an extension of a critical race theory. And so I think that's probably the newest part of my journey, is looking at critical mixed race theory.
It occurs to me that we introduced the idea of the doctrine of discovery, but didn't really say what that was. Would you be willing to just sort of tell us what you do in that work and what it is?
Yes, so the Doctrine of Discovery, it actually, I think I found out about it about 10 years ago. And I actually thought it was a book. So I was like, hey, where's this book on the Doctrine of Discovery? But what it actually is papal bulls. And it was by the Catholic Church. And what it did is, when Christopher Columbus came over to, he did that sailing the ocean blue thing. And so when he landed on the land, which he actually did not even land in the United States. So when he landed, he recognized that there were people there, and that there was a land base there, and these people had rights to the land. So he needed a means by which to take the land. And so the Catholic Church gave him, they wanted control of that. And so they came up with papal bulls that gave him permission to conquer the land and subjugate the people, because the people were not considered Christian. And so because they were not Christian, they were not considered human beings. And so the Doctrine of Discovery is rooted in this idea that Indigenous people not being Christian, then we can consider them not human, we can take their land, we can subjugate them, we can make them slaves. And so what ended up happening is, when they come to the United States, they need a land base, and so they begin the genocide of Indigenous people. And then when they get the land base, then they need a workforce to build up this land base. And so that instituted the transatlantic slave trade. And so then you get the enslavement of African people, bringing bodies over from Africa to work the land. And so these two play very much off of each other in the building up of America. And it started off as a theological, philosophical framework, but then it was instituted into law in, I think it was 1823 in McIntosh, Johnson versus McIntosh, and then is instituted and bedded into property law today. And Canada picked it up and uses it. And now it is used as precedent globally in how countries deal with Indigenous people, and use it as justification for taking land.
It is evident that you've done a lot of teaching about this, and I reflect on your earlier statement saying you didn't think you're a teacher.
I know.
I'm not sure I agree with that, because you're very good at what you when you teach on this. And I know from being around you that you've done this in you've done exercises, interactive exercises around the Doctrine of Discovery for years now in many, many different settings. And again, if any of you ever get a chance to hear Erica do that, once we're through COVID-19, et cetera, she's brilliant at it. She and her colleagues just do an amazing job in sort of getting that experientially presented to groups. Erica, you've been in and around a lot of predominantly white institutions, working Mennonite Central Committee and elsewhere. This class is focused on dismantling racism in those PWIs, predominantly white institutions. So perhaps there's two questions just to have you reflect on a little bit, if you would, in that, what are there things you've seen, the biggest challenges you've seen faced by predominantly white institutions as they dismantle racism, and then the biggest opportunities as well? Observations about that, anecdotes, just any sort of, what does that bring up for you?
Right. Oh, the challenges. I think the challenges, I think specifically when I think about the institution like that I work with, it's interesting that it's like you get them to have the conversation about racism or systemic racism. But what I've noticed is they only want to go so far. But then when we start getting into the intricacies of anti-Black racism or anti-Asian racism or anti-Indigenous racism, no one wants to talk about that. Or when we get in so far as we work off of donations, when we think we're going to upset a donor base, then we will only go so far until we affect the money. And so it was interesting to see that we're starting to do these land acknowledgements, but then at the same time, we're having this 100-year anniversary of celebrating our organization. Well, celebrating our organizations means that we're kind of celebrating the colonization of these European Mennonites coming to the United States and settling on stolen native land. And so we have this big celebration, and they don't do a land acknowledgement, right? But it's so colonial the way that the celebration played out. And I'm sitting there thinking, of course, like we can go back on our anti-racism, because here we are like fundraising money. And so I think when it comes to money, is always going to be the challenge. And what I have found is I don't know if it's guilt money, but my program brings in a significant amount of money. And I don't know if it's because people feel guilty. So it's like, oh, I got to give some money. I don't know. I might be all right with that. I don't know. I can't say I don't know about guilt money, but I think we need to change our thinking, around what brings in money. And I think the opportunities, I just think there's tons of opportunities there. I like these documents. One of them is White Supremacy Culture document, that talks about the ways that white supremacy culture works as far as like perfectionism and urgency. And I just keep thinking, yo, that shit don't even work for white people. Like, I don't know who wants to be nitpicked. I don't know who wants to run up against perfectionism. Like, I don't know who wants to work in that kind of environment. And then I like this other document that says qualities of authentic relationship, where it's like the willingness to, like be wrong or be in environments that encourage our growth, or things like that. And I'm like, hey, like I want to be there. And I think there's opportunity there, like, because these ways of whiteness, like, they only dehumanize not only people of color, but like, yo, white folks, you all dehumanize too. You just like get used to it or something, I don't know. But like, I think there's so much opportunity to like have that balance of like, yo, can we just be human? Like, and understand that we operate within these structures of oppression and systemic racism and all this kind of stuff. Can we hold those both true, like, and function in those complexities? And I think that just gives way to like creativity, and I'm interested in that because I think I've spent the greater part of my anti-racism journey like taking shit apart, like and that doesn't bring life. Like that just like makes me lose hair. And I'm just like, yo, I want to be creative. Like, what can I do that like helps me create? Um, but yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And I think the emphasis on naming the tensions that are there, particularly in a predominantly white institution like MCC, at that very moment is just incredible. I'm actually just going to go right into a question that just came into the chat because I think it reflects on what you've just said, and then we can go to the other questions later. But Laura Wogelmuth writes, Erica, I hear what you're saying about celebrating 100 years and the conflict with the unspoken land theft and mistreatment of Indigenous people. Where is the balance between celebrating the good work an institution has done and still take ownership of responsibility for the impact on the Native American community?
I think it's in those, I think of that white supremacy document where it says, you know, the culture of white supremacy is always that either or thinking. And I think the freedom is in those both and statements. And so it's like, yes, we're celebrating this, and we have to realize at the same time, like that we're celebrating this is what was happening for another community. Like at the time we may not have known it, but now we have the consciousness to know that when we came in, that we were coming in on the displacement of Native people, and we know this now, and so we can add that as an and statement to what we know now, because to not add that seems dishonest. And I think it's always those and statements, like continuing to change the story. And I remember going through some significant counseling, and the counselor always telling me, you know, like with trauma, you want the story to change. And so I think about Mennonites and all the trauma that they had coming over from Europe. And I'm like, yo, when's your story gonna change? Like, let's change the story. Let's add to this narrative, because now you know things. Things are different. Like you're telling the same story, and can we add to this narrative? Yeah, so that's some of what I think about.
Thank you, Erica. I mean, to build on what you said, one of the gifts that the womanist movement has given us is exactly what you talked about, the whole idea of binomiality, of the both and rather than the either or. So thanks for bringing that to our attention and sort of putting that in front of us. It's such an important concept to counter white supremacist values within predominantly white institutions. Well, the next question I have builds on what you've just been reflecting on, perhaps inviting a bit more narratives if you have to share any with us. As you have watched and been a part of some of those efforts within predominantly white institutions to try to address and dismantle racism, are there any stories or anecdotes about when things have gone badly, they've gone awry, or things have gone well? Do you have any sort of those stories to bring to our consciousness?
One thing I specifically think of is they were trying to do this. I think it was like supposed to be fun for people of color. It was like this people of color retreat, and we're all like, okay. Oh God, now I'm just remembering they did it twice. Okay, the first time they did it, oh sweet Jesus. Okay, so the first time they did it, I legit thought it was gonna be fun. And so I went, and they break us into these affinity groups. And of course, like you get the African American affinity group, the Latina affinity group, and then you got me. And no one accounted for like the lone native. And then you got an East Indian, and then you got a Korean, and no one accounted for like who's gonna facilitate us. And I think it was actually like when we got together, we organized ourselves because we're just like all standing at the snack table being like, what do we do? Um, and when we organized ourselves, we actually really realized how harmful that is because of how anti-racism gets becomes like such a black and white issue. Um, and then when we break off into people of color groups, it's like our stuff gets undergirded. And then in that space that was supposed to be fun, we get undergirded as well. Um, and I think that went hella wrong. And then it went wrong again the next year when I didn't want to go because I didn't think it was going to be fun because it wasn't fun the first year. And I went the second year, and the affinity groups they broke us into were African American, first gen, second gen, like third gen. Those were the groups you could go to. And uh, everyone was in a group again but me. And I'm just like, there is something foundational that we are missing in our analysis if, as people of color, we fail to acknowledge the indigenous people even in an affinity group. Um, like we have like, yo, white people even acknowledge indigenous people, like, and sometimes I think it, in some ways, it's easier for white people to acknowledge indigenous people because it's completely different. But I think it gets harder for people of color to acknowledge indigenous people because they think we're all the same. But in terms of law, you're either Indian or non-Indian. And to be non-Indian, people of color would be grouped with white people, right? And so I think when you think of things in terms of that, it gets very difficult for people of color to have that sort of conversation. And I find those conversations people aren't willing to have because then we start talking about land. And then we start talking about decolonization because you can do anti-racism without being decolonial. Um, and I think some of the things that have gone well, there's a lot of things that have gone well. I think when specifically like my program is allowed to have what I would term sovereignty, when we're allowed as indigenous people to say that we're going to use this certain amount of money to take indigenous people to the UN, and they don't have to identify as being Christian. They don't have to be connected to the organization. They just have to have a need, and they need to be heard at the UN in order to further their country. And so we had some of that with people from Papua who needed to be heard. We had that with some people from Panama that needed to be heard. We had that with some people from the Philippines, indigenous communities that needed to be heard, that we were able to give money to go to the UN and give some interventions on the violence against women and against the land that was happening in their communities.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. That was under the auspices of MCC?
Yes.
Wow.
And
Central States or the UN office?
Central States.
Wow, that's great. We could go into a whole history of how significant that is, given where that organization started 30 years ago.
Yes.
So that's really very hopeful. I hadn't known that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, super hopeful.
Yeah. Well, thanks for mentioning that. It also occurred to me, Erica, that I introduced the idea of your work with the Indigenous Visioning Circle. Could you tell us a couple words about what that is, how it's conceived? I think you've begun to do that, but tell us a bit more because it's such an important way of doing that work.
Okay. So where we started was we actually had a physical unit on the Pine Ridge Reservation where we did a lot of social work, where we like the community, if people needed firewood through the winter, we would hand out firewood. If people needed money, gas money, we would give out small gas money grants or things like that. And interesting enough, like how it had worked prior to me working there was it was all white people, and the program functioned well with white people living on the reservation handing out money to Native people. And then I came onto the position, and at that time I was married, and my husband, my ex-husband, was from the community. And when we came on, no one wanted to work with us. The dynamics of two Native people working within a Native community under a Christian organization umbrella, it just did not work. And so we decided, we had gone through a process and had met with other nonprofits in the community and decided that we should do bigger work, that MCC had access to the UN, they had access to a Washington office to affect legislation, and could do all this other work, and that we weren't necessarily helping the community. And so we moved our unit off, and then that morphed into my work now, which is, we like to term it like more macro work instead of just working in one community. And so working with the UN, working with the Washington office on legislation affecting the violence against Native women. Right now there's a lot of land stuff going through, a lot of stuff with pipelines going through. So looking at stuff like that, looking at the Doctrine of Discovery, and educating churches, and trying to work with youth and get them involved in different sort of processes. So, and just connecting, trying to connect people with different organizations. And so now doing more of that type of work and seeing what I hear at the UN, seeing what I hear out and about, and then bringing it back to the churches.
Wow, that's so exciting, so huge. I visited the Pine Ridge unit years ago,
Yeah.
and I think that has become, this again is just mind-blowing. It's again an anecdote, a story of true institutional transformation.
Yeah.
Thank you for all your work in making that happen. Well, we've got some good questions coming here. I'm just going to jump into them if that's all right with you, Erica.
Okay.
So here's one from John Ellingson, who writes, great question. He says, I don't understand the concept of decolonization. Could you please explain it?
I don't either, John. Just kidding. No, I kind of don't. I feel like I'm still like, I feel like it's like, I always look online and there's these definitions, and I feel like for the most part, a lot of the definitions are just like this idea of undoing colonization, like the harm that has been done by colonization. But I feel like for me, it's been more than that. I just don't want to become the opposite of what I don't like. And so for me, I think that was a starting point, like being in opposition to what I don't like, but I think it's been incorporating more things. And I think one example that has been hitting me lately is in the social justice community, we have this big movement towards pronouns. And so what has been acceptable is using pronouns. And so when I look at my traditional language, it's not a pronoun-based language. And so I think that in order to be justice-oriented, we use pronouns. But I think in order to be decolonial, I'm not sure what that means because we don't use pronouns. And so I actually think to use pronouns for me as an Indigenous Cheyenne woman is actually a step back. And so looking at that decolonial, what does that mean if I don't come from a pronoun-based language? And things like that. And I also think of that in terms of when I look at, I went to a conference and we had a situation where we had binary bathrooms. And so the solution to the problem was to make all the bathrooms gender neutral. And that was a social justice move. But for me to be decolonial was actually to look at it and say, hey, we have Native elders here that have suffered um, abuse from boarding schools, and a lot of the abuse took place in the restrooms. And so because of safety, in order to decolonize the harm that was done by colonization, by making them go to boarding schools, we need to look at how do we make that safe for a Native elder. It's no longer a gender problem, it's the safety of that bathroom beyond gender. And so for me, that's part of what it means for me to look at decolonizing that. It means we add in a lot more complexity, but some of the harms that have been done because of colonization.
We're always in the midst of that history. We live it every day, and thanks for bringing that to our attention. Another question coming in. I'm interested from Darcy. Darcy Warden. I'm interested in critical mixed race theory. What do you recommend reading, watching, and or groups to connect with?
Okay, so I think if you Google them, I think if you just Google critical mixed race, they have a conference coming up at Arizona State University. It's supposed to be February 2021, and they have tons of resources on there. And I love that conference. If you're looking for expansion on critical race theory, it's fabulous because it talks about how in the United States, mixed race people were supposed to bring about this coming together of everything, and that hasn't happened. And how, like, as early as, you know, like kindergarten, little kids know that mixed race kids don't fit. And that the only way they can make sense of it is to see like both parents. And so that they have fabulous research in how it plays out, and even how mixed race people don't necessarily fit into either racial group. And then they also interrogate the phenotype. If you end up looking white, and if you end up looking dark, and there's a lot of good resources like how it plays out in other countries where European features are valued. The mixed race people end up being the models if they end up having European features, whereas then you can also see where it becomes anti-Black if they're mixed with Black folks. Usually, like I think in Japan is a lot where it happens. But yeah, it's fabulous research coming out of there.
And Rachel Carol Rivas from MHRN has put in the URL for the Critical Mixed Race Studies website. So that's in the chat for anyone who wants it. This next question comes from Robin Abishah. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Any thoughts about how to go about changing some of the colonization narrative taught in so many public school K-5 textbooks?
Ooh, man, I don't know. I think about this. I love this video. I just rewatched it. I can't remember the woman's name, but if you Google the danger of a single story, have you seen that, Tobin?
I've seen it. It's been a while, but yeah, it's very good.
Yes. And I'm just like, I rewatched it, I think last week. And it talks about like, okay, if you start the story here, of course you're going to come out with this outcome. But if you start the story here, you're going to come out with this outcome. But I don't know if it means like we change the textbooks, or we just add an additional textbook, or like we add an additional like teaching. Because I feel like word on the street is like the textbooks come from some big long line of, it's really hard to get them changed somehow. And so I don't know if that means like we bring in additional resources to add to the narrative, or expand on the narrative, or because I know when I was going to school, I got the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria. Like, well, how do I remember that? Like, and I honestly was so immersed in my Northern Cheyenne identity that I didn't even know what Indians were. Like, I knew I was Northern Cheyenne and I didn't know what an Indian was. And so when I read that history, I was so distanced from it, that I didn't know they were talking about me. Like, I didn't know they were talking about me. Um, and my nieces don't know they're talking about them. Like, when you see Peter Pan, um, my nieces are like, what are those? And they don't know that that's like the stereotype of them. But yeah, I'm not sure. I think maybe just adding additional stuff, and that additional stuff is out there.
I mean, I'll just add the work of Louise Derman Sparks and her colleagues in the anti-bias curriculum is another addition to that. I think it's not adequate in and of itself, but another great piece to add to the story. And thanks to Kelsey in the chat for putting up the danger of a single story link. That's there for everyone again. Appreciate that, Kelsey. Here's a question from Alex Clark, which circles back to your question about land acknowledgements. Alex writes, thank you, Erica, for joining us. I'm wondering if there are best practices that you would suggest predominantly white institutions follow when developing and delivering land acknowledgements. I've done online research, but it feels too superficial. However, I'm not aware of a resource that would be more meaningful. What pitfalls should we be aware of? What practices would you suggest we follow?
Ooh, I recently got super pumped up again about land acknowledgements because I have a homegirl that's like totally over them, and I'm not over them. Like, I'm still in them. But what I got pumped up over is I ran across the basis of the Doctrine of Discovery, which is terra nullis, which is this concept that, Tobin, I can hear you typing. You're not sneak typing.
Someone asked a question about one of the links. Sorry.
I know, but I felt like the way you were typing, you had this look like, no one can hear me. No, we hear you.
Thank you for calling me out.
You can tell we've known each other a long time.
I'm sorry, Erica. Sorry for interrupting.
But
Land acknowledgements. Don't forget land acknowledgements.
I know, I'm still fired up. But no, so this idea of terra nullis is literally dehumanizing Indigenous people and dehumanizing them by saying they weren't on this land and they're not humans. So if I contrast this with land acknowledgements is pretty freaking, like, what's the word, out there. Like, a land acknowledgement is pretty much undoing 500 years of history and like being protestinal. I made that word up. It's like out there. It's like you're raising your fist and you're being like, hey, I'm up here and I'm saying that these people are humans, and I'm saying it out loud, and I'm saying their tribe, and I'm saying that they were on this land, because literally I'm undoing terra nullis, like, and I'm putting people here, and they are people. And so when I think of land acknowledgements like that, hell yeah, I'm doing land acknowledgements, and I'm doing them like every single day in every single way. And even if I like get the name wrong and I say it wrong, it's like, it don't matter, because for me, it's like the ancestors hear it, the spirits hear it, like people hear it and they're like, what the heck she's saying? But you said it, you know? It's like out there, it's roaming around, and yeah.
Are there any particular resources that you'd point people to that you trust that are good to, or is that homework we need to do on our own?
I feel like there's like a good video clip. I can't remember what it's called. But it's of filming of Indigenous people in the US, and it's just saying how much like they appreciate being in space where one is done, because often they're the only ones in that space, and how invisible like we often feel, like literally. And then when someone gives a land acknowledgement, it feels like, oh, like you can relax a little bit, like, okay, like we just got acknowledged, like we may not feel fully comfortable, but like maybe now we can breathe a little bit, and at least people know we exist. Like we don't have to fight for our existence in this space because someone already brought us in. And so it's actually a really emotional clip. I think it's about 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Um, and then they have like a little booklet. I think it's like 2, 3 pages long. Um, I can send it to you, Tobin.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I'll send it out to the class then. Thanks, Erica. That's
Yeah, and it kind of outlines like how to do one.
yeah, that'd be very helpful. Thank you so much. Um, really powerful to hear you talk about that. I appreciate you doing a little more extended commentary on their importance and the effect of them, because I think sometimes the thought is that, oh, you're just going through the motions, but those emotions count, right? I mean, that's what I think you're telling us.
Yeah, and I think too to also recognize like acknowledgement for Native people. Yo, that is hammered into us when we are like little bitty babies. And like we're always having to, as little kids, like acknowledge everyone, everything. And that's like one of our biggest things that we have to learn. And in the language, the opposite of that, to not acknowledge, is to be angry at. Like if you don't acknowledge someone, you're mad at them. And so if you think of that in terms of culture, like of course like doing a land acknowledgement might feel uncomfortable, and it should be, because you're operating out of not your own culture, like you're operating in someone else's culture. And so to think of that also, that that's an added component of cultural competency, right? It's like I'm not doing this to necessarily serve myself, so of course you're not going to feel comfortable.
Yeah, that's really helpful. There's a couple more questions coming on land acknowledgement, but I want to go back to one we missed earlier from Kristen, who writes, what specific programs have you developed in working with youth? Have you been involved with youth educational programs? Anything you want to say about that?
Um, I've been a part of youth programs that have already been functioning, um, like some Boys and Girls Club stuff, some stuff at Montana State University, Bozeman, your rivals. Um, uh, as far as developing it from the ground up, I haven't, um, but I'm super interested in that area. We are hoping to do, with my work, do some youth exchanges, taking youth to the UN, um, and then hoping to do some cross-cultural exchanges to like Guatemala with some indigenous youth from the US and Canada, and then exchanging that way, all around colonization and things like that. It hasn't come to fruition. We had a lot of issues internally with MCC, and then also then COVID hit when we started to interrogate those issues. But eventually that's actually where I would like to work.
Oh, wow.
Because I feel like I've timed out. Like I might look youthful, but I feel like I've moved into the stage of holding space for youth.
Yeah.
And I feel like I do that well, and I would like to hold that container for youth.
That's very cool. I hope that will open up sooner rather than later for you, Erica. That's really cool.
Yeah, before I can't move fast.
Before you get any more gray hair.
I know!
Okay, we come back to the conversation about land acknowledgement. You showed them to me. You pointed them out to me earlier.
I love my gray hair.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. You may have noted I have a couple.
Like 5.
Yeah, just 5. That's it.
I love my gray hair. They're like so shiny.
Well, you look very distinguished in them. I'll just say that.
I know, that's what I feel like. I want them to make me look a little more aged, because everyone thinks I'm like 25.
You have a very youthful looking face. I mean,
Oh,
I said
stop
that
it,
very
Tobin.
youthful. Sorry, but the maturity comes through as soon as you open your mouth and you start talking. It's all there.
That's not true because I goof around too much.
No, you don't. Okay, next question. So Laura Wogemuth asks, so does a land acknowledgement simply state the truth about the land we are inhabiting? Is there legal implication with them as well?
No, not as far as I know. There's no legal implication. And some of the thing we try to encourage is it's really complex, hey, because um, there's like tribes are nomadic, and so you can do statements that show movements that these tribes were here, and then during this time frame, some other tribes may have moved through. But what we try to encourage is to use as much present day language as possible, to not put Native people in the past. I've heard a lot of land acknowledgements that make it sound like Native people are in the past. And I think if it is named that Native people aren't present in the place, to make sure that's because of European uh, whatever colonization or means of that. Legal implication, I don't think there's any. I know at the UN level, we were trying, there's only legal implication around apology. Um, I hate apology, but it is strategic legally to try to get organizations such as churches to do apology, or the government to do apology, as a form of acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And I think that's the only place I can think of legal implication.
Thank you.
Tricky legal implication.
Yeah, right. This is a question from Rachel from Montana Human Rights Network. She asks, are you able to speak from your current work about dominionism and how it threatens Indigenous rights, or speak to how romanticization is a form of anti-Indigenous racism?
You know, I don't even know what dominionism means. I know in some of my presentations, there's usually a couple white guys in the presentation that kind of get into that argument. And I'm not like, I don't even claim to be Christian. I tried a couple times, maybe 3 times, and then got into one of those evangelical groups in college where they tried to make me figure out how some kind of bridge with, I think, I don't know, I was supposed to walk across it and then Jesus was waiting for me, or, and then I had some verses to memorize. Tobin, you know, I just found out like a week ago that that was evangelicalism. I didn't even know what evangelicalism
Yeah,
meant.
for sure. That's a big
Yeah, I was in the group because we got free pizza every week. Like, but yeah, so I never caught on because the picture never made sense. Like, I couldn't figure out how big, why the tree, like, there's not a tree big enough to span the Grand Canyon. Like, I was literal and they were figurative. And I couldn't ever memorize the verses because they just did not make sense. But yeah, romanticism, totally, like, you can see that stuff like in any tourist shop. But I really think the extra harmful part of the romanticism, oddly, I think it plays out differently by gender. For men, it's like it gets men taken extra seriously. I have a best friend, Harley Eagle. Tobin knows him. Ugh. He has the native man ponytail, and literally women go batshit crazy over him. And when I'm hanging out with him, I'm just like, ugh, like I can hardly stand it. And it's like they romanticize everything he says. Like he can say nothing wrong. And I'm just like, yo, I gotta leave this space. I'm about to throw up. And like, it's horrible. But for me and Native women, the romanticization ends up just being uh, abusive and sexual, and probably why we got the high rates of murdered and missing Indigenous women. Um, the men don't have those rates, right? And so you see the differences in gender and how that romanticization can take out. I never get that ooh and ah effect when I talk like Harley talks, and sometimes my ponytail has been longer and prettier, but his ponytail always gets lusted after over my ponytail.
Yeah, the two of you are a powerhouse when you're in the same room, but that dynamic, I've seen that dynamic play out numerous times with the two of you in front of the room. It's the real deal. Absolutely. Gender is such an important topic to bring into the conversation, just as you did. So yeah, it's real
You
stuff.
wouldn't believe how many times I will say something and they'll divert to Harley, and then Harley will be like, actually, I think Erica just adequately answered that. And I'll be like, yeah, like, but I'm doing that, yeah, like secretly on the inside, and I'll be like, on the outside.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. Here's another question from McKenna Andrews, who writes, Hi, Erica. Thank you so much for your time and letting us pick your brain. This session has been so fun. My question is, in Montana, it feels to me as a white individual that reservations are still so separated from white civilization. In schools, students learn about the tribes as such two-dimensional characters, and surely via outdated textbooks, in my opinion. Perhaps this was just my education experience, but I dare suggest that Montana could improve relations and inclusion here, just like most of the US probably. What are your thoughts on this, and how do you think this could be improved? And here talking about education in the schools.
Yes, I so agree. Like, I think in seventh grade, they introduced, like, everyone has to do Montana history. And that history book, I think, was predominantly like the Oregon Trail and a little bit on like the natives. And I I honestly I do not even know. Um, I don't even know how it happens, because the way I feel like as a native person in Montana is much how my Black friends feel in the South. How the South is to Black people is how I feel a lot of the northern states is to Native people, like Montana, Wyoming, let's go North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska. All of those feel like any other ethnicity would be welcome but a Native. And so I'm not sure how you introduce a curriculum when that blatant racism is still so, it could just explode at any minute. Like, um, I just feel like it's just, so I don't even know. Like, I know when I go to Billings, it, I just moved home from Kansas, where people think natives are cool. And so they like me because I'm not Latina. And so I felt like a rock star in Kansas. I was actually in the hospital for a bit, and everyone was coming to see me because my last name was Littlewolf. And they're like, oh, are you really Native? And I'm like, hey, yeah. And but the thing is in Montana is when I moved back, I was like, wow, I don't even like, I don't even get to like trying to figure out the systemic racism, because everything's still blatant. Like, I'll be in Target and some white lady will walk by me with a cart and just be like, move Indian, and stuff like that still very much happens. People, my dad is very dark skinned. Um, he will get pulled over by the cops all the time, and asked if he's been drinking. Um, it's just so incredibly, it's like not even developed racism that I feel like I could appreciate. So I don't even know how we introduce that in schools when it feels like at any moment things can just erupt, like it's that tense. um it feels like the only things, like, as Montanans that we can agree on is like, let's not have corporations come into Montana. You know, it's like those big statements, like things like that, or let's all still hunt, or, you know, it's like things like, let's keep our water clean, you know, but we can't compartmentalize that and like, let's keep it clean for natives, you know, kind of thing. You can't do that. So I really don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a challenging question. I'm going to be speaking with a group of elementary school teachers next week as they're starting off the year and talking about racism. And the main message I'm going to give them is to stop just talking about difference and start talking about privilege, power, and hierarchy. And
Right.
you can't talk about those three things. We're doing more damage by talking about difference. Because if you flatten it, you ignore the very kind of reality you've just talked about. And
Yeah.
that's the big paradigm shift they've got to get through.
Like, I think just up in your area, wasn't last school year there was like, um one of the native volleyball teams didn't want to go to a volleyball game because the other team was making jokes about murdered and missing Indigenous women.
That's true. Yeah, I can't remember the specific school involved, but I think you're
So
exactly
I'm like, how do you even think that's funny? Like,
right.
yeah, so I'm like, man, there's like just a huge gap.
Mhm. Yep, there's a lot of work for us all to do. Well, we are nearing the end of our time here. Couple good questions coming in here. One about the connections of Indigenous people around the world and the legal implications of apology. Another one on children's book to help introduce the truth to young kids. Any quick comments about either of those broad and immense topics you want to add, Erica, in the last couple of minutes we have?
Okay, I love Louise Erdrich. She has the bark birch bark books, birch bark books. Oh my God, you got to say that 5 times fast. And she has her own bookstore in Minneapolis that you can order from, and literally you'll get a signed copy. She has fabulous kids books, um, and young adult books with pictures, because I actually like to read those. Um, and what was the other question?
Just asking about if compensation is required when people give apologies, and is it important for Indigenous people in the world to be connected in order to energize them for standing up for their rights?
Heck yeah, on connecting Indigenous people, like, it's super empowering, because like when we do that at the UN, I mean, technically we have like the formal sessions, but there's less people in the formal sessions than there are out in the lobby. Everyone's in the lobby, like, connecting and building networks, um, and trying to figure out how we get our Indigenous brothers and sisters voices to the forum, because it has become such a such a powerful place relationally, that countries won't give their people permission to leave. And so our people from Papua and our people from the Philippines didn't get permission the second year to leave, because it's starting to be seen as dangerous. And so now the technique is, so then how can people like from the US and from Canada, how can we get their voices and speak on their behalf, like in a good way? And so anytime like we're able to connect, um, it's easy to connect. Like we have similar, not the same, similar value systems, similar stories of colonization, um, similar ways of hospitality, and wanting to maintain culture in a bigger culture that's trying to always dominate. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Erica, for being with us. And for those of you who have cameras to turn on, please turn them on and give a hand wave and a thank you to Erica for being with us. Thank you so
Whoa,
much,
it's like
Erica.
the whole class just showed up.
Right, they're all there. And we are so grateful for your time, your attention, and the energy. And as I said at the beginning, the great humor that you bring to these conversations. So thank you so
It
much.
was so fun.